lose your entire department leadership. Every single AAG will walk out on you. Your entire department leadership will walk out within hours. And I don't know what happens after that. And I said, Mr. President, within 24, 48, 72 hours, you could have hundreds and hundreds of resignations of the leadership of your entire Justice Department because of your actions. What's that going to say about you?
That's what happened last time. Hi again, everybody. It's 5 o'clock in New York. That's what happened when Donald Trump wanted to install coup enthusiast Jeffrey Clark at the top of DOJ last time he was president. That conversation, as told under oath, is what ensued. Our institutions and those who worked in them were able to prevent Donald Trump from following through with what he wanted to do, which was driven by his worst impulses. But now, with Trump set to return to the White House to be our president again, the open question being watched the world over is, will that be the case again? Will one man threaten that, quote, the entire department leadership and hundreds of others will walk out? Will he be restrained by anyone like that? Will he abide by the rule of law and people like Mr. Donahue, who were more committed to upholding the rule of law than Donald Trump? As we've heard from Donald Trump himself and his allies, Donald Trump plans on installing more loyal people and more of them in every corner of the federal government in his next administration. But he has paid special attention to and zeroed in on the Department of Justice as something he can specifically weaponize. He has said it out in the open that he wants to use the Department of Justice to go after, to prosecute, and to punish his enemies. And according to Project 2025, an independent Department of Justice is no more. That's gone. We won't have that again. They write that the Justice Department in the next administration should do this, quote, issue guidance to ensure that litigation decisions are consistent with the president's agenda and the rule of law, end quote. There's the Supreme Court, a usual check on the executive branch, which this summer showed it believes that this president is immune from prosecution for all official acts. And Special Counsel Jack Smith, who for the past year and a half has investigated and then indicted the ex-president over his role on January 6 and his mishandling of classified documents, including national defense information, is now moving to wind down both of those federal cases before they ever see the inside of a courtroom. New York Times reports this, quote, Trump's success in using his campaign as a protective shield has no parallel in legal or political history and highlights the many ways in which politics and justice have become tightly, if uncomfortably, entwined since he first sought the presidency 8 years ago. What happens to the rule of law in America is where we began with some of our favorite experts and friends. Former top official at the Department of Justice, MSNBC legal analyst Andrew Weissmann is here, plus staff writer for The Atlantic and author of Autocracy, Inc., Anne Applebaum is here. Thank you to both of you. Andrew, your thoughts on any and all of this?
Well, I think that you are absolutely right to highlight this. We do have what happened in the first presidency in terms of the rule of law, and I think there's no reason to think that it's going to be any better. I should note, there's just to tie this in to civil cases where the president, in a normal private civil case, for instance, the one brought against Rudy Giuliani, does not have direct authority. It's not part of the Department of Justice. But he could weaponize the Department of Justice against the plaintiffs. He could weaponize them against the lawyers. He could weaponize the Department of Justice against people like Letitia James, who has brought a successful civil suit. So there are many ways, even in the civil realm. But in the criminal realm, we're already seeing it with this idea of a drumbeat of going after people like Liz Cheney, where there's no factual predicate for it, but the White House does have control over the Department of Justice. I should note, though, on the good news side, is that at the end of the day, grand juries are involved, judges are involved. And when I think about the sort of threats about Liz Cheney, in many ways, I think, you know what? Does Donald Trump really want a case involving January 6th in a criminal courtroom? I mean, he's been fighting that for years. And going after Liz Cheney is only going to result in the revelation of damning facts. So some of this, I think, is something to really worry about, and some of this is something that may be saber-rattling with the idea of using it for fear so that people toe the line and don't raise objections and aren't as vocal and exercising their First Amendment rights in the way that they should be.
Andrew Weissmann, I'm going to ask you some questions that put you on the spot. So if you don't want to answer them, I will understand. Donald Trump has never gotten over the cloud that hung over his presidency because of the Mueller investigation. And that was put in motion by serious questions of a Russian attack on the 2016 election. The original concerns were whether the Trump campaign wittingly or unwittingly. There was a presumption that maybe they didn't even know about it. When those were investigated, everyone that touched that was fired, smeared, and or some combination of both. Some of them were audited aggressively by the IRS. They include people you know well, Jim Comey, Andrew McCabe, Pete Struggley. I mean, the list is lengthy. None of that will happen. If there's a question about something that a foreign adversary does and it touches Donald Trump, there's no mechanism to investigate him if he controls the Department of Justice and the FBI. Donald Trump will probably never be impeached again. The Republicans, at least for the first 2 years, control everything. And the Supreme Court has given him absolute immunity. With that articulated, let me just play what he said he plans to do with all that power.
What they've done is they've released the genie out of the box. You know, when you're president and you've done a good job and you're popular, you don't go after them so you can win an election. They've done indictments in order to win an election. They call it weaponization. And the people aren't going to stand for it. But yeah, they have done something that allows the next party. I mean, if I happen to be president and I see somebody who's doing well and beating me very badly, I say, go down and indict them. Mostly that would be, they would be out of business. They'd be out. They'd be out of the election.
So it's a little incoherent, but saying out loud that he plans to use the department as he sees fit to go out and get them. What should the country be prepared for, and what, if anything, should DOJ be prepared to be asked to do at his direction?
Well, first of all, for the people at the Department of Justice, their oath of office is going to be what has to guide them. But you're right to point out that one of the plans is to politicize the leadership. And if possible, they're talking about actually having that be the career people would also be replaced. And so that you won't have the people who will simply refuse to take action based on their oath of office, as we saw in connection with the effort to overthrow the will of the people that culminated in January 6th. I think one of the mistakes that people could make from this election, even with the results in terms of what's happened in Congress and the presidency, is for the people taking power to think that it's a mandate for the policies that they're advocating. And they really is, I think, a risk of them going way too far and overreading the results of what happened. You can see that, for instance, just in terms of reproductive rights. But I think it's probably true in other ways where you could end up with the incoming administration really going down the autocratic route that Anne has written about so cogently, and alienating many of the people who were voting for Trump for other reasons, but were not actually embodying his policies. And with the Department of Justice, it may not be the top of everyone's mind. Obviously, for people like me, for lawyers, for people who've been in the department, I view it as a cornerstone of our democracy, and as something that autocratic regimes, it's one of the first things that you go after to be able to take sort of, exclusive and reclusive authority and to chill any sort of opposition to what you're doing. But I do think there really is a heightened risk here in overreading the results of the election.